Hey everyone, CWD Music Reviews here. I'm CWD, and this is going to be a music review of the new Mount Eerie album, A Crow Looked at Me. This is the latest full-length album of the indie rock, experimental rock project Mount Eerie, fronted by singer-songwriter, multi-instrumentalist Phil Elverum. Phil Elverum's been around for quite a while now. A lot of people know them for the microphones. The Glow Part 2 being like the pinnacle of what the microphones would release before transitioning into the name Mount Eerie. Mount Eerie have experimented with a lot over the course of their existence. There was one album in particular, I believe it was called Wind's Poem, that experimented with black metal. And they've pretty much experimented with a lot of other different styles in between. Just the sheer amount of experimentalism alone still made what it was Phil Elverum and company were going to do next fascinating. But this album in particular, it's vastly different from this time around. Not just in terms of musical styles and all that, but because of recent events. This album is released following the death of Phil Elverum's wife, Genevieve Castret. In the middle of last year, around July, after a diagnosis of pancreatic cancer and a long fight against it, Genevieve Castret eventually succumbed to her sickness. Not too long after that, a couple of months I believe, Phil decided to start recording an album's worth of material revolving around how he's feeling about the death and the events surrounding the death. Specifically from the diagnosis, actually it even goes further back to Phil's early years as a young adult to about November of last year. What's interesting about this project in particular is that Phil recorded and made a good chunk of this music in the room that Genevieve died, and he also, I believe, is using some of the instruments that Genevieve had. Phil himself with this project has said that this isn't even music at all, it's just this confessional of sorts about grief, loss, this void that he is left with. I had an anticipation for this record, but simultaneously I was also kind of fearful of it, given the fact that the singles that I've heard from this album are incredibly depressing, but the songs themselves were still structured particularly well. So I thought I definitely would give this a try and see what exactly Phil ended up with. So I gave this thing numerous tries. I gotta say, this thing is not just rife with emotional potency in terms of the lyrics, in terms of the somberness of these chords that Phil is able to conceive, but it's also ended up being probably one of the best albums of the year. This album is about 11 tracks in length. It's about 41 minutes long. There's not really going to be a moment where it's going to drag or anything of that nature. You're not getting an hour long of music like, say, The Glow Part 2 or other Mount Eerie and Microphones albums in the past. But if anything, the overall production and the stylistic direction that this album in particular is going in kind of does remind me of The Glow Part 2 in a lot of ways. You're getting a lot of acoustic type of instrumentation and production going on. The guitar chords on this, both acoustic and occasionally electric, are gorgeous. The opening track, Real Death, has this faint accordion going on that kind of drones, but it doesn't like mask over the track. The track Soria, Moria has this thick little guitar drone going on that is definitely adding to a lot of layer and tension. A lot of what Phil is doing on this album isn't really anything new for him, for Mount Eerie, or for the microphones. Even then, there's definitely a kind of potency, a lot of vulnerability to what Phil is doing with this project. Tracks like Ravens and Santa Moria, they definitely feel long, winding, and particularly intricate. I do like how Raven ends up progressing all throughout. I do like how the acoustic guitar chords feel all fluttering in a way. This is a very somber and particularly depressing record in terms of the instrumental compositions. Tracks like Swims, My Chasms, and Seaweed sound particularly dark, particularly downtrodden. It's kind of breathtaking how he's able to do so much with so little on this project. Toothbrush Trash, where it starts off as like this slow and depressing type of acoustic guitar thing before it really picks up with these brighter and dynamically contrasting piano chords. And there's this particular moment, one of the few moments of percussion on this album, where he mentions that a door closes and there's like a literal closed door sound, or like some kind of bang that goes on right after that, which I thought was pretty interesting. What Phil is doing with this particular project is particularly intricate in its own stripped back and minimalist kind of way. This isn't a particularly lo-fi record. We're not going full on The Glow Part 2 in that regard. Everything is pretty clear here. Everything is given its voice, even if it's particularly low-key, including Phil in terms of vocals. I think if there is a sliver of complaint I could have with this record, is that Phil doesn't really change up his vocals all that much throughout the record, but he pretty much does something similar on The Glow Part 2. Since Phil, even at close to 40 years old at this point, is still particularly capable at singing, he still has quite a bit going for him vocally. Especially when it comes to this downtrodden and emotionally potent thing that he's going for. In which case, the lyrics are probably the strongest thing about this record. There's pretty much two ways to interpret this thing. One, it's just Phil going on about all of his events and how he feels about them. Or two, Phil is directly letting the listener know what grief feels like. Right out of the gate, you get the track Real Death, where he pretty much blatantly says that at some point when someone dies, you're not really thinking about how you're going to make art out of this. It is not for making art. When he walks into the room where Genevieve dies, everything about him fails. His brain, his knees, any semblance of words that he could come up with. And I do like how this is the opening track, because I'm pretty 100% sure that when Genevieve did die, critics, fans, and even maybe fellow musicians were wondering what kind of art he could make out of this. Since if you listen to records like The Glow Part 2, he is without a doubt a master in terms of poetry about things like depression, death, the natural course of life. And I think it was very important for him to drop this particular single first, because it serves as kind of a disclaimer that you shouldn't be viewing this album or shouldn't be viewing death as an opportunity for an art project. Throughout the record, Phil is highlighting certain aspects of his grief that he goes through and different moments of his life that he is exhibiting. A track like Seaweed, where he talks about how Genevieve has been dead for only a week, him and his one-year-old daughter that Genevieve gave birth to, but following the birth she was diagnosed with cancer. But anyway, Phil and his daughter go out to go look at the lake that they dumped her ashes in. Even though he doesn't view Genevieve's ashes as her anymore, he seems to view her as the sunset. There's actually a moment on this track where he tries to remember if foxgloves were her favorite flower, but he can't seem to remember because Genevieve did all the remembering for him. He's noticing all this symbolism around him, even though he's not sure what all the symbolism means, or if he feels like it's directly related to his now dead wife. Ravens, for example, he talks about going out and splitting 2x4s for kindling, and he looks up and sees 2 ravens and only 2 of them flying out, and he realizes that that's technically an omen, but he's not 100% sure what for. And then as the track goes along, he starts highlighting that she got cancer and that they planned on moving into this island somewhere, but that plan has been scrapped because of this diagnosis, because of pregnancy. He talks about how he's waiting for her to get back from wherever it is she is, but then he remembers death is real. The track Forest Fire, this is how far the symbolism goes. There was this big old forest fire due to a heat wave that just kept ongoing and ongoing all throughout a good chunk of the summer. And this was around the time Genevieve died. And he's gotten so used to the heat because of this forest fire, because of the heat wave, that he's pretty much used to leaving the doors and windows open to like let air circulate. And he remembers that the last time it rained she was still alive, whereas the months goes on it starts getting cold and he forgets to just close the doors. He's so used to leaving those open, not touching anything, because they were open last when Genevieve was alive. See, even the sheer heat, even the sheer blistering inferno of a forest fire and a heat wave reminds him of her. The track Swims is particularly depressing. He talks about how the image of his wife's dying face will go away with time, and that's what their counselor said. The counselor that he and her used to walk to every single day before Genevieve couldn't walk on her own anymore, so then they drove instead. 2 months after Genevieve died, their counselor died, and he notes that it seems as if her purpose has been fulfilled. Later in the track, his daughter asked if Mama swims. He replies, of course she does. And it's as if it's all she does now, since the ashes have now gone into the lake. Kind of a morbid moment there. Not morbid in a funny way, but in a brutally honest and particularly depressing kind of way. The track My Chasm is pretty interesting. He talks about how he is nothing but this big old void of memories of his wife. And he talks about how he wonders if people get particularly annoyed and particularly irritated when he talks about his wife all the time being dead. There's actually this one line that stuck out to me where he talks about how he can turn a grocery store aisle into this attention-grabbing canyon of pity. The track When I Take Out the Garbage at Night, it's probably my least favorite track on the record. I mean, I get that the lyrics are about how he feels some sliver of escape when he goes out at night to take out the garbage. I feel like that it's a bit brief for me. I mean, I get that the lyrics are adding to a certain layer to this kind of grief that he's going through, but just on a personal level, this track doesn't really feel that fleshed out in a way. But that's a particularly lowbrow thing to say in a way, since when I wanted to go through this album, I wasn't sure what kind of standard I was gonna put this on, since this is a guy pretty much having an emotional exorcism at this point of his life through this album. How in the fuck is anyone going to critique such a thing? I actually even hesitated reviewing it because of what this is to Phil. Here, Pitchfork, Consequence of Sound, a few other places are still reviewing it as if it's nothing but a musical project that just slapped onto their desk, when it's just more than that, more than words can describe. No one should be reviewing this, no one should be hearing this, but here we are listening to it, and here I am actually just reviewing it. Anyway, the next track, Emptiness Part 2. This is a particularly interesting track as well. He talks about the concept of emptiness and grief. He notes that this was cool to talk about long before he knew his way around the hospital. And the track Toothbrush Trash, I believe this is the cut where we finally reach the apex and the climax of this grief, as he talks about how he finally doesn't hear the echo of his wife all across the house. He doesn't feel as downtrodden or as hesitant about throwing away the bloody rags that are in the bathroom that have been there since she died. Her old toothbrush, even a fly that has kind of taken up residency in the bathroom, has been shooed off. He is not going to kid anyone. This does not feel good, but he does feel this is necessary. And the track Soria, Moria, I feel is like the kind of emotional centerpiece to the album in a sense. He talks about how in his early 20s he decided to say fuck the world and live in a cabin somewhere. He got a letter from Genevieve that he was going to meet her now. But then we see this like really swift passage of time going around, like how in January, yeah, she was still alive, but how long and why is she still being kept alive? Because her porcelain skin has gone, quote, jaundiced and fucked. He talks about this painting in a museum in Oslo, Norway, that is called the Soria Moria. He sees a kid in the painting that's in this haunted castle of sorts, and right before him is this big, vast canyon of fog. And eventually he's come to realize that symbolically even this is traversable. In a sense, I feel like he's relating this to the grief he's feeling all across this album. And the closing track, Crow, it definitely leaves itself off on a very, very somber and particularly fulfilling note. He talks about how his daughter is dreaming about a crow. By the way, I do like the line where he says, and I'm paraphrasing to an extent, "Sweet kid, what is this world we brought you into? Fascist and motherless." Even then, I feel like he has moved on, or is mostly moved on from this. But they go out to see the forest fire mentioned, and how all this stuff that he mentioned reminds him of his wife is. The wind blowing that used to remind him of his wife doesn't seem to anymore. The forest fire, the lake. The one little thing he notices is that he no longer seems to view all these things except for the one bird that they somehow saw in the middle of winter, a crow. And he talks about how his daughter seems to be dreaming about a crow in her sleep, and there she is. Oh, fuck, man. In the same way death did not deserve to rob Genevieve of life this soon, is the same way that music fans, critics, and even fellow musicians do not deserve the creative talent, the poetic intricacy of Phil Elverum. I was kind of skeptical of this thing in a sense, given how he seemed to work on this thing not too long after his wife died, given how this isn't just a commercial project or just something to submit to the label so that way you can get like dissected and all that. This is a pure confessional. This is pure therapy in a sense. Given as many listens as this thing as I have, I can say that Phil Elverum has come through with one of his most emotionally potent records in a long, long time. For better or for worse. It's hard to recommend this thing to people unless you're already a fan of Mount Eerie, unless you have a love for indie folk, or if you're a fan of Genevieve's previous art projects or musical projects in a sense. How am I supposed to recommend an album that is born out of tragedy? How am I supposed to straight up say you should listen to this thing when it is probably going to be the most depressing thing you will probably hear this year? But I will say this is definitely a fantastic album. I realize that throughout this review I've been speaking in a low-key kind of way because this thing is just difficult to talk about, as is grief, you know. If this album does anything for anyone, it should make people reevaluate grief. Because in the words of Phil on the track Swims, we are all so close to not existing at all. This album is a plus 2.6 out of plus 3. I'm not even sure how often I'm going to return to this, given how just outright agonizing it is lyrically. I would definitely say give this a try. Give this a few tries. You'll probably get something out of it. But if you give this album a listen, what'd you think of it? Did you like this album? Did you dislike this album? What was your reasoning for that, and what should I consider listening to and reviewing next? This CWD Music Reviews here, signing off.